The words hit me like a cold wind. I stood in James's kitchen, holding a casserole dish I'd spent 3 hours preparing. He sat across from me, his face arranged in what looked like practiced politeness. His girlfriend, Victoria, stood slightly behind him. That's when I knew. "Mom, we've talked about this," James said calmly. "You need to understand that Victoria and I are building something new. We don't need you dropping by unannounced anymore." I blinked. Dropping by unannounced? I'd called yesterday. He'd said it was fine. My hands didn't tremble as I set the casserole on the counter. At 58 years old, I'd survived harder things than this moment. But standing in my son's kitchen, watching him look at me like I was an inconvenience, something inside me went quiet. "I see," I said simply. "You're always trying to insert yourself," Victoria added, her voice sweet as poisoned honey. "James needs space to grow. You're holding him back." I looked at my son. He didn't meet my eyes. That was when I understood. This wasn't James's decision. Not really. But I'd learned a long time ago that sometimes silence speaks louder than arguments. I turned and walked toward the door. "I hope you're happy," James called after me. I didn't respond. I just left. The days that followed were strange. My friends called, asking if everything was okay. I told them yes, just needing some space from my son's family. The lie came easily. What I didn't say was that James had stopped answering my calls entirely. What I didn't mention was seeing his social media posts about toxic family members and unhealthy relationships. I learned through Facebook that he was telling people I was controlling, that I'd never let him make his own decisions, that I'd held him back his entire life. The word stung, but I stayed calm. I said nothing publicly. I didn't defend myself or correct his lies. My neighbor, Susan, brought over tea one afternoon. "I saw those posts," she said gently. "That's not fair to you." "People believe what they want to believe," I replied. But inside, I was doing something else. I was watching. I was remembering. I was connecting dots that had been scattered for years. All those financial decisions James had made with Victoria guiding him. All those moments when Victoria whispered something in his ear and suddenly he agreed with her. All those times he cut off other people in his life, his college friends, his mentor from work, even his sister. I began writing things down, not out of anger, but out of clarity. I had spent 30 years building a life with my son. I had been there for every moment that mattered. And now, watching him erase me from his story, I realized something important. The truth has a way of demanding to be heard. When James was 12, I worked 2 jobs to keep us afloat after his father left. He needed braces. I needed dental work. I chose his braces. When he was 16, I stayed up all night helping him study for his college entrance exams. When he was 22 and lost his first job, I let him move home for 6 months rent-free while he found his footing. I remember the day he got the job at Henderson and Associates. He came home glowing, ready to change the world. I made his favorite dinner, lasagna from scratch, the way his grandmother taught me. We celebrated like it was Christmas. "I'll help you buy a decent suit," I offered. He wore that suit to his first day of work. And for the first few years, everything was good. He'd call me on Sunday evenings. We'd have coffee together on Saturdays. He introduced me to his girlfriends, brought them to family dinners, treated me with respect. But somewhere along the way, things shifted. I remember when he started making more money. I remember when he stopped calling on Sundays without a reason. I remember the first time he looked at me with mild irritation, like I was asking too much of him simply by existing in his life. And I remember thinking that one day something would break. Something always does. The question was whether I'd be ready when it did. Victoria appeared in his life 2 years ago, and everything changed. She was beautiful in that polished way. Expensive highlights, perfect nails, designer clothes she mentioned buying frequently. But more than that, she was ambitious. And she saw James as a stepping stone. I noticed it at their first dinner together. The way she'd touch his arm when his boss was mentioned. The way she'd laugh at his jokes even when they weren't funny. The way she'd subtly criticize his choices before he had time to make them. "That shirt doesn't really work with that tie," she'd say. "Maybe you should ask for a promotion soon. You're not getting any younger in that position. Your mother seems nice, but she's probably lonely. We shouldn't encourage her to rely on us." And James, who had always been thoughtful and independent, began to agree, began to change. His friends stopped coming around. His sister barely heard from him. And I became the problem that needed solving. I watched this happen with a clarity that broke my heart, because I had worked so hard to raise a man with integrity. And somewhere between his childhood and his ambition, integrity had taken a back seat. Or maybe it was never really there at all. That thought was harder to accept than his rejection. The new circle didn't include me. I learned about James's promotion through LinkedIn, not his phone call. I found out Victoria had moved in permanently through a throwaway comment he made about needing to adjust finances. The dinner stopped. The calls became shorter. The invitations ceased entirely. When I tried to reach out about my birthday, he texted back, busy season at work. Maybe next month. Next month came and went. I stopped asking. But here's what they didn't know. I had spent 30 years watching my son. I had learned the patterns of his thinking, the way his mind worked, the values he thought he held. And I had watched as Victoria systematically rewrote his entire perception of me and of himself. I wasn't angry about it. Anger is a luxury for people with less to lose. Instead, I was practical. I began documenting things. The promises he'd made to help with my medical bills. Promises I never asked for, but he'd offered enthusiastically. The times he'd borrowed money and paid it back late or not at all. The conversations where he talked about his future plans, which he suddenly claimed he'd never discussed with me. I wasn't preparing for a fight. I was preparing for inevitability. Because people like Victoria don't stop. They keep pushing until they break something. And when they do, the pieces fall in ways no one expects. The stories he told about me became more elaborate. I learned from mutual acquaintances that he was saying I had tried to control his relationships, that I had manipulated him financially, that I had somehow damaged him through years of guilt-tripping and emotional blackmail. None of it was true. But the beautiful thing about lies is that they spread quickly. What spread slower was the truth. The photos I had from his graduation, where he's smiling because I was in the audience. The letters he'd written me from college, thanking me for believing in him. The receipts showing he'd borrowed $5,000 from me for a vacation with Victoria that he'd repaid in 2 installments, both late. I kept everything organized in a folder on my desk, not because I wanted to hurt him, but because the truth, when it finally emerges, needs documentation. It needs proof. It needs structure. My friends asked me why I didn't just post the truth online, why I didn't defend myself publicly, why I let him rewrite our history unchallenged. Because, I told them, when you're telling the real story, you don't need to yell it. I simply waited. Silence is a powerful thing. People interpret it in ways that comfort them. James probably thought my silence meant I was defeated, broken, finally understanding that I had been the problem all along. He probably mentioned it to Victoria, who probably smiled and squeezed his hand, confirming that they had made the right choice in cutting me out. But my silence wasn't surrender. It was clarity. I continued my life. I went to work at the library where I'd spent 23 years helping people navigate information. I kept my small apartment clean and organized. I spent time with my daughter, James's sister, who had always been my anchor. I joined a book club. I started walking 3 miles every morning. And I prepared. I met with a lawyer quietly, not to sue my son or take him to court. I had no interest in destroying him. But I needed to understand my options. I needed to know where I stood legally, financially, and practically if everything collapsed. The lawyer, a sharp woman named Patricia, asked why I was doing this. Because I said, I want to be ready for the truth when it decides to reveal itself. She nodded, like she'd heard this before. Maybe she had. Maybe every mother who realizes her child has stopped seeing her comes through her office with the same mix of sadness and determination. I organized my finances with new intention. I reviewed my will. I made sure everything was clear, documented, and protected. Not against James, but for myself, for my future, for the life I had worked so hard to build, which apparently he no longer wanted to be part of. What no one knew was that James had asked me for help 1 year ago, before Victoria completely isolated him, before the rejection became official. He needed someone to co-sign a large loan for a business investment. Victoria had suggested it. A real estate opportunity, she'd said. Quick returns, solid investment, very exclusive. He'd need $50,000 to get in on it. I had that money. I'd saved carefully for decades, planning for retirement, for emergencies, for the unpredictable moments that life throws at us. And I'd said no. He was shocked. I remembered his face, like I'd betrayed him personally. I love you, I told him carefully. But I can't co-sign something I haven't fully researched. It's not about the money. It's about risk. He'd pushed. Victoria had called later, her voice honeyed and concerned. Margaret, sorry, I mean your name. He just thinks you don't believe in him. It would mean so much if you just. I believe in him enough not to sign something without understanding it fully, I'd said firmly. That investment? It fell through 6 months later. The company closed. People lost money. People who had co-signed were pursued by lawyers. James never mentioned it again. But I think that moment is when Victoria decided I had to go. I was the obstacle between James and the life she wanted to build for him, or rather, with his resources and in his name. James celebrated quietly, or so it seemed from the outside. No grand announcements, just a steady erasure. He got promoted. He and Victoria got engaged. They bought a house, with a mortgage James somehow qualified for without my co-signature on anything. He posted photos of the new place, the new car, the new life. Victoria appeared in every photo, her hand on his arm, her smile perfect and certain. He looked happy. Or what passes for happy when you've surrounded yourself with people who only reflect back your own reflection? I saw all of this from a distance, like watching a film I'd already seen the ending of. I was not surprised when the wedding invitation arrived addressed only to my daughter. I was not shocked when he didn't call to ask me to come. I was simply there, waiting, like someone who knows a storm is coming and has already closed the windows and secured the roof. Patricia, my lawyer, had given me a folder with instructions. Just in case, she'd said. When you're ready to use this, you'll know. I kept it in my desk drawer, untouched. Not because I didn't believe I'd need it, but because I wanted to be absolutely certain before I acted. The truth doesn't need rushing. It just needs the right moment. The call came on a Tuesday night at 11:37. I know the exact time because I was getting ready for bed, and I glanced at my clock when the phone buzzed. It was unknown number. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. Is this Margaret? A woman's voice, shaky and formal. Yes. Who is this? This is Officer Reynolds with the Henderson Police Department. We have your son, James Morgan, here. He's been in an accident. We need you to come to the hospital immediately. The world stops in moments like that. Everything you've been waiting for, everything you've prepared for, suddenly becomes irrelevant. Because standing in front of you is the thing you feared most, the possibility of losing him for real. I didn't ask questions. I grabbed my purse and called for a car service. My hand shook as I locked my apartment. 20 minutes later, I was in the emergency room parking lot, running toward the entrance. James was in trauma assessment. That's what they called it, a formal term for the moment when doctors determine how broken you are. I found him in a pale blue hospital gown, his left arm in a temporary cast, his face cut and swollen. He looked small, vulnerable, like the boy who used to ask me to check under his bed for monsters. Mom, he whispered when he saw me. That word, that single word, full of need and recognition. It broke something in me that I thought Victoria had already broken beyond repair. I'm here, I said, moving to his side. I'm here. The official story came in pieces. He'd been driving home from a business meeting, some deal Victoria wanted him to pursue, when another car ran a red light and hit him broadside. The doctor said he was lucky. Another few inches and it would have been worse. Much worse. Victoria hadn't answered her phone when the police called. Neither had any of his friends from work. It was me. Always me. Still me even now. The doctor pulled me aside while James drifted in and out of medication-induced sleep. He's going to need care for the next few weeks, Dr. Hassan explained. Physical therapy, regular checkups, someone to help him move around. No driving for at least 6 weeks. Someone needs to be there. I nodded. There was never a question. Of course I would be there. News of the accident spread quickly. By morning, people were asking James about it. His boss sent flowers. His colleagues texted concern. And Victoria? She posted on Instagram, "So grateful James is okay." What a scare. Love of my life, you had me worried. No mention of visiting him. No mention of staying by his side. Just a public performance of concern, perfectly timed for maximum engagement. I was there when she finally showed up, 14 hours after the accident, wearing perfectly applied makeup and designer jeans. She smiled at James, kissed his forehead, and immediately started taking selfies with him in the hospital bed. "This is so sad," she said to the camera. "But we're strong together, right, babe?" James looked uncomfortable, but didn't object. I pretended to adjust his blankets and said nothing. Silence was still my strategy. But people were starting to notice things. A nurse mentioned that Victoria had asked about his insurance coverage before asking how he felt. A hospital volunteer saw her checking her phone more than looking at him. My daughter, who came to visit that afternoon, pulled me into the hallway. "She seems really concerned," my daughter said, not quite convinced by her own words. "She seems something," I agreed quietly. The cracks began small. A comment from the hospital social worker about how Victoria had mentioned something about complicated finances and whether James would be able to continue supporting them during recovery. A phone call James got from his bank about unauthorized charges on his credit card, charges Victoria had made without asking. I didn't say anything, but I was listening. And more importantly, people were starting to watch. Because accidents reveal who people really are. They're like earthquakes. They show you the foundations that were already cracked. One morning, James's boss came by. His name was Walter, and he'd always seemed like a good man. "James, I need to ask you something," Walter said carefully, glancing at me then back at James. "Did you approve the business loan Victoria discussed? The one she wanted you to take out against the company's stock plan?" James's face went pale. "She said it was already approved." "No," Walter said. "She signed her name on preliminary paperwork. We caught it before it was processed. I wanted to tell you directly." After Walter left, James stared at the ceiling for a long time. I made tea. I said nothing. But I was finally seeing the moment I'd been waiting for. The moment when reality becomes too large to ignore. By day 5, James needed help with everything. Showering, dressing, eating. He couldn't move his left arm, and his right leg was too painful to bear weight on. He was entirely dependent, and for the first time, he wasn't dependent on Victoria. He was dependent on me. And as I helped him sit up, as I held glasses of water to his lips, as I made phone calls to his physical therapist and pharmacy and doctor, something shifted in his eyes. Not gratitude exactly, but recognition, understanding. "You came," he said one evening, watching me organize his medications. "Of course I came," I replied. "She said you wouldn't. She said you'd be too hurt to help me." I didn't answer immediately. I just kept organizing. Orange pills in the morning, white pills at night, blue pills with food. Each one a small detail of care. Each one a tiny act of love that Victoria couldn't perform because she was busy being disappointed that his injury had inconvenienced her. "I'm your mother," I finally said. "That doesn't stop because you asked it to." He started crying then. Deep, shaking sobs from someone whose walls had finally begun to crumble. I held his hand carefully, so as not to jostle his broken arm, and let him cry. On the 7th day, James asked me to get his laptop. He wanted to check his emails, make sure work wasn't falling apart. I brought it to him and left him alone, knowing what he would find. When I came back an hour later, his face was gray. He'd looked at his bank statements. He'd seen the transfers Victoria had been making to her own accounts. He'd noticed the equity line of credit she'd opened in his name. He'd discovered that she'd filed a loan application for $50,000 using his social security number and without his knowledge. It was exactly what she'd wanted him to do for her investment opportunity. Except this time, she'd forged his signature. "Call Patricia," I told him quietly. I knew he didn't know who Patricia was, but I'd already given her permission to discuss his case with him if he called. "She's a lawyer. She can help." He stared at me. "How did you?" "I know you," I said simply. "I've always known you. Even when you didn't believe in yourself. I believed you would eventually see the truth. Victoria's control collapsed like a house of cards in wind. Once James actually looked at the documentation, the real documentation, not the lies she told him, everything fell apart simultaneously. The police got involved about the fraudulent loan. His company's legal team addressed the stock plan issue. The bank froze the accounts where she'd been making transfers. And suddenly, the beautiful woman who'd been whispering poison in his ear became someone he barely recognized. She tried to spin it, to claim James had known everything, that they were a team, that she was being scapegoated. But she'd made one critical mistake. She'd left a digital trail. Emails, text messages, bank records, forged documents, and there's no coming back from evidence. James watched from his hospital bed as his life collapsed and reformed. His boss put him on administrative leave, not as punishment, but for his own good while everything got sorted. His best friend came to visit after I called her and explained what had happened. His sister brought him home-cooked meals, and Victoria stopped answering his calls. A witness, someone James respected deeply, helped him understand what he'd been unable to see. It was his college mentor, Professor Williams, someone James had cut off at Victoria's suggestion 2 years ago. I'd reached out to Professor Williams after the accident. He came to the hospital, and he sat with James for 2 hours. He didn't say, "I told you so." He didn't say anything at all about Victoria. He just talked to James about who he used to be, who he wanted to become, and the strength it takes to see the truth even when it hurts. The hardest thing about life, Professor Williams told him, is knowing when you've made a mistake and having the courage to fix it. James cried again that day, but these were different tears. These were the tears of someone finally waking up. The moment of truth came during a formal meeting with hospital administrators, police, and James's legal team. Victoria was supposed to be there, but she'd already disappeared, moved back to her mother's house in another state, leaving James to deal with the wreckage she'd created. Patricia presented the evidence, the forged documents, the unauthorized charges, the systematic financial theft. Every item I'd documented, every promise he'd made and not kept, every conversation where he lied about his past. Not to destroy him, but to make him understand. He looked at each piece of evidence like he was seeing his own reflection for the first time and didn't recognize what he saw. "I let her do this," he whispered. "No," I said quietly. "You didn't know." She made sure of that. But he was facing the fuller truth, that even though he hadn't known about all the fraud, he had known about the way she treated me. He had known about the isolation. He had known, deep down, that something was wrong. And he'd chosen not to see it. The public reckoning was smaller than I'd imagined it would be. James didn't hold a press conference or post on social media. Instead, he called the people who mattered. He called me and apologized. "I'm sorry, Mom, for all of it, for everything." "I know," I said. "How can you forgive me? I said terrible things. I blamed you for—" "Because that's what love means," I interrupted gently. "It means there's always room for coming home. But forgiveness, I'd learned, is not the same as return. Love and boundaries are not opposites." I moved into his house temporarily to help him through his recovery, not as an act of mercy, but as an act of practical love. He needed someone, and I was still his mother even after everything, even through everything. But I was also clearer about what I would accept going forward. We had conversations about what the future would look like, about respect, about honesty. I wasn't his enemy, but I also wasn't going to be someone he could dismiss when a prettier lie came along. "I want to be part of your life," I told him one evening as we sat on his porch, "but only in a way that feels honest. Only if you truly want me there." "I do," he said immediately. "Then we'll need to rebuild that," I replied. Slowly, carefully, without pretending that what happened didn't happen. He nodded. He understood that my strength didn't come from forgiving him immediately. It came from being clear about who I was and what I deserved. The consequences landed in practical ways. Victoria faced criminal charges for forgery and fraud. The loan was denied. The transfers were reversed. James had to work with his employer to rebuild trust and clarify his own role in the situation. He'd been manipulated, but he'd also been careless about his own financial security. It wasn't dramatic justice. It wasn't the kind of moment that plays well in a movie. It was the slow, grinding work of facing consequences and learning from them. James paid back every cent of what Victoria had taken. He worked overtime. He reduced his spending. He became, slowly and painfully, someone who understood that freedom comes with responsibility. But the real consequence, the one that hit hardest, was the loss of innocence. James came to understand that the woman he thought he loved had never existed. She was a construction, a performance, a carefully crafted image designed to extract whatever she could from him. And he came to understand that his mother, the woman he dismissed and blamed, had been real all along. Present, honest, waiting. He grieved for both things simultaneously, the loss of the illusion and the rediscovery of the truth. 6 months later, James was walking with a cane and didn't need one at all. Physically, he'd healed. Emotionally, he was still learning how. But I was proud of him for doing the work. Not for my sake, but for his own. One evening, he asked me to help him move a box of old photographs. There I was, again and again. At his graduation, his first day of work, his college acceptance letter, his childhood birthday parties. Moments where we were happy, where I was the person he trusted most. I threw this away in my mind, he said quietly, looking at a photo of the two of us. But I kept it, I said. I kept all of it, because I knew the truth would still be there, waiting to be seen. I started building my life in new directions, not away from James, but for myself. I took a class on digital design. I joined a writing group. I traveled to places I'd always wanted to see, but never prioritized because I was too busy being the person James needed. My life didn't depend on his redemption or his return. It depended on me, on the strength I'd always had, the clarity I'd always possessed, the integrity I'd always maintained. Victoria tried to rewrite my story, but I was the only author who could do that. When friends asked if I was happy that James had finally understood, I told them the truth. I'm happy for James. But my happiness has never been dependent on whether he gets it or not. A year after the accident, James and I had lunch together. Not at his house, not at mine, at a small cafe in the middle, neutral ground where we could rebuild something new without the weight of the old. He told me about therapy, about understanding his own patterns, his own need to be validated by someone who saw him as powerful instead of helping. He told me about his apology to my daughter, to his friends, to people he'd hurt in the wake of Victoria's influence. And I listened, not as someone waiting to be repaid for my grace, but as a mother watching her son become someone real again. I don't expect you to trust me the way you used to, he said finally. No, I agreed. But I'm willing to build something better. Something truer. Something that can't be broken by someone else's lies. He nodded. And in that moment, I wasn't celebrating his fall. I was celebrating his rise. And more importantly, I was celebrating myself. For having the strength to wait, the wisdom to prepare, and the courage to still love someone even when they didn't believe in themselves. The truth won, not because I screamed it, but because I lived it. Every single day.